Intermittent fasting can be a great way to lose or regulate your weight, but did you know it's also a fantastic way of boosting your levels of human growth hormone, minimizing your chance of getting diseases such as Alzheimer's disease and certain forms of cancer, and also a way of optimizing your gut microbiome. Now, if that's of interest, watch on. Hi, I'm Dr. Dan Pronk. I studied medicine on an Army scholarship, and then after successful completion of the Australian SAS selection course, I served for 5 years with special operations, including 4 tours of Afghanistan. On discharge from the Army, I completed a Master of Business Administration, sparking a keen interest in entrepreneurship and leading me to co-own multiple small businesses. I'm passionate about resilience and well-being, especially in the military, veteran and first responders community. I've authored multiple best-selling books, and I'm also a proud father and car lover. So welcome to my show, where I'll be discussing all of these things and more. If you're anything like me, you grew up with the mantra that breakfast is the most important meal of the day being drilled into you. And so we sort of came to learn that we needed to be eating all the time. You know, first thing in the morning, you had to get up and pack some food into your head, which was often high carbohydrate foods, things like your breakfast cereals full of carbs and often sugars, and this sort of idea that if you didn't eat regularly, that somehow we would run out of energy or come grinding to a halt. And the reality is that nothing could be further from the truth. And in fact, there's some significant benefits of having periods of fasting, this intermittent fasting. And there's a lot of science behind this now. It's gained momentum in the last decade or so. People have become very interested in this as a human optimization tool. A lot of that's been driven around things like weight regulation or maybe losing weight, interest in reversing some of the diseases that come from basically overeating, which is where we're at in a lot of developed countries. We are, as a community, we're killing ourselves through excess. We're eating too much, and the effects of those excessive calories on our body are driving diseases like diabetes, like heart disease, and there's some real power in intermittent fasting to combating those diseases. And when we look at our requirements to eat, when we go back to, say, the caveman days is a great way to frame this discussion, and eras like the Paleolithic era or paleo, people might have heard of that diet and that movement, which relates to the foods that the cavemen of that era might have been eating. But when we think about human evolution from that perspective, back in those days, food wasn't readily available. It's not like it is today, where we can get our hands on food whenever we want. We can eat until we're full whenever we want. Back in the caveman days, it was slim pickings, and particularly in the winter months when the fruits weren't fruiting, when things weren't blossoming, there wasn't that source of the fruits and vegetables, when animals might have been harder to hunt, and so we didn't have those protein sources. So humans, from an evolutionary perspective, needed to adapt to these periods of fasting, and we've done that. We've got those adaptations that allow us to not only survive, but in many ways to thrive in the fasted state. And that's come from that human evolution through those periods where food wasn't readily available, particularly carbohydrate wasn't readily available through those winter months. And so those benefits are still within us. Those evolutionary adaptations are still within us, but most of us aren't tapping into them because we have ready access to food, and so we're eating regularly and we don't fast deliberately. So when we're talking about intermittent fasting, it's as the name suggests. This is deliberately going for periods of time where you don't eat, going into that fasted state. And now certainly we need to keep our fluids up. That's a different story. We need to stay well hydrated. The human body doesn't go well without fluids for long periods of time. So you've got to maintain your fluids. You can drink plenty of water, things like soda water, maybe some diet soft drinks if you like, but certainly not the full sugar soft drinks that are high in sugars, carbohydrates. You know, you can use black tea, you can use black coffee, these sort of things. But what you're aiming for during these periods of fasting is not putting any calories into your body. And what happens during these states is it kicks off a few processes in our body that can be quite adaptive. So the first one I want to talk to in this video is the release of a hormone called Human Growth Hormone, or HGH. So people might have heard of human growth hormone. It's, as its name suggests, fundamental to us growing and developing as people. So we're releasing a lot of HGH during our youth into adolescence. It helps our body develop and grow. Once we've hit adolescence and are moving into older age, we release lower levels of HGH, but we're still releasing it, and it's got a fundamental role there in restoring our cells and regenerating our cells. So every cell in the human body has got a planned lifespan, and it differs depending on what cell it is in the body, but it will generate, it will live its life in a healthy state, and then all healthy cells are programmed for a thing called apoptosis, which is programmed cell suicide, basically. So they have a period of life when they're healthy, and then when they start to malfunction or start to get a little bit older, they know to undergo this apoptosis, and they die off, and a new one comes in its place. So a new one gets regenerated and built in its place. And human growth hormone plays a role in this. So it's constantly in our system, but as we age and as we go into our later years, we release less of this human growth hormone. But intermittent fasting is a great way to spike human growth hormone levels. People might have heard of HGH being used as a performance-enhancing drug in elite sporting realms, and indeed it's a banned substance in elite sport for the very reason that I've just described. It is something that will help your cells regenerate and be optimized, and so it stands to reason that it can give athletes an unfair advantage, so it's banned in elite sport. People are looking at it more recently as a bit of a fountain of youth, if you like, in the whole anti-aging type movement, looking at the role of human growth hormone to be able to slow down or try and sort of stall the aging process. If we can release more HGH or have more HGH in the system, we can combat these effects of aging as we go along. So it's a really interesting and important hormone in our system, and we know that fasting increases the release of human growth hormone. There was a great study that came out recently looking at a cohort of young healthy men, is what they did this study in. They fasted them for 2 days, and on average it showed that it spiked their human growth hormone release by 500%. So these massive 5 times increases in HGH release just simply by fasting for a 48-hour period, which I appreciate's a pretty long fast for someone who isn't experienced in that area. But when we look at the overall safety of fasting for the average healthy person, the science tells us that you can probably go for up to 2 months without eating, without any significant ill effect on the body. And our body has these evolutionary mechanisms to be able to maintain its energy levels for long periods of time without putting calories into the system. And that spike in human growth hormone, once again from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense. So human growth hormone will help us preserve our lean muscle mass. So it stops our body from preferentially breaking down our muscles, the good stuff. And when you think of that caveman wandering around in winter, he needed to somehow preserve his muscle mass so that he could hunt and gather in these winter months. And so it makes sense that we'd be releasing more human growth hormone to help preserve that muscle mass so that person could stay functional to hunt and gather and scavenge what they could in terms of calories over winter. So number one of the lesser known benefits of intermittent fasting is these spikes in human growth hormone that we see when we're in the fasted state. The second one is a concept called autophagy, or autophagy, sometimes it's pronounced as, but autophagy is a really fantastic process where our body starts to preferentially break down certain cells to use as building blocks when we're not getting nutrients into our system. So when we're eating regularly, we're in what's called a metabolic state. Our body recognizes that there's lots of food coming in, lots of nutrients, it gets digested in our gut. Little building blocks of that food get released into our bloodstream, circulate around the body, and the body recognizes that it's got plenty of resources to build what it needs to build, to keep our bodies functioning, to keep our cells regenerating. If there's extra calories in what we take in, then our body stores that. It's another evolutionary thing. It puts it away for use later if we may go into that fasted state. And so that often gets packed away in the form of fat, which is why why we get fat if we eat too much in excess of our calorie requirements. And so when we go into the fasted state, though, our body recognizes that we don't have as much nutrients coming in. It recognizes that we're not putting these building blocks into our system. And so it starts to go looking around the system for cells that it might be able to break down to then liberate those little building blocks of things. Say, for instance, the building blocks of our proteins in our body, a thing called amino acids, need to be broken down, liberated, so we can use them in a good fashion to build new cells. And that's this autophagy process. When our body recognizes that nutrients aren't coming in, because we're in the fasted state, it goes from that metabolic state where we're just building things all the time with what's coming in to what's called a catabolic state. It starts to hunt around our body and look for cells that it can break down to liberate these building blocks that it needs to use to keep our systems functioning at an optimal level. Now, the beauty of autophagy is that it will preferentially break down bad cells. So it doesn't just go around the system breaking down any old cells to get these building blocks. It will look preferentially for cells that aren't functioning optimally. So cells that might be a little bit damaged, cells that are getting a bit older and moving more towards that apoptosis, that programmed cell death, so older cells that aren't functioning as well, infected cells, and also cells that are starting the process of mutation towards diseases that might cause Alzheimer's disease, that might be precancerous states, or even cancer-infected cells. Some studies are suggesting that autophagy has a role as an adjunct in treatment of certain cancers. There's other studies suggesting that regular fasting might indeed prevent certain cancers establishing themselves in our body through this process, because our body will go around, it'll hunt these damaged cells, these infected cells, these precancerous cells, and it will release those good bits from those cells as building blocks. So autophagy is another really powerful side effect of intermittent fasting, and we only click into that when we stop putting the nutrients into our body and go into that fasted state. The third one I want to talk about in this video relates to optimizing the gut microbiome. Now, people will have heard of the gut microbiome. We've known about it for hundreds of years, and basically all of us have trillions of bugs living in our gut, and they do some essential functions. And in the last sort of 15, 20 years, we've become more and more aware and interested in what's known as the brain-gut axis. So this link between our gut and how our brain functions. And that goes both ways. The brain communicates with the gut and vice versa. It happens through direct nerve pathways, but also through the release of chemicals called neurotransmitters. So these chemicals that can be manufactured in the gut, travel in the bloodstream, cross the blood-brain barrier, and then have an effect on our brain to do things like regulate our mood and other functions. And so there's this strong link between the brain and the gut that goes both ways. And to optimize that link, our overall health, both physical, there's some great studies looking at optimizing gut microbiome and how that relates to our physical health, but equally our mental health through that gut-brain axis and some of those mood-regulating neurotransmitters. To optimize that, we need to have an optimized gut microbiome. And if we're constantly eating particularly high carbohydrate foods, things like alcohol have a disastrous effect on our gut microbiome. That one makes sense when you look at, we all use alcohol rub, particularly in the COVID days, to clean our hands. We know that alcohol kills bacteria. We know there's a stack of good bacteria living in our gut, so it makes sense that if we're pouring alcohol into our gut, it's going to kill off those good bacteria in our gut. But we also know that when we eat regularly, it stimulates our gut, it keeps our gut working. Some certain foods, high carbohydrate diets, can be quite inflammatory to the gut lining. They can affect the balance of the gut microbiome. All these trillions of little bugs that live in our gut need to be in a healthy balance. You can't have certain ones overgrown and other ones undergrown. If they get out of balance, we can have these gut microbiome problems that can then affect the lining of our gut. People might have heard of the term leaky gut, And what that refers to is when the gut lining starts to fail as a protective barrier and starts to let bad things from the gut into the bloodstream, which can kick off inflammatory processes around your body. And what we know is that when you fast, that gives your gut the chance to have a rest. It gives your whole digestive tract a chance to have the rest. It's great for things like your insulin system, which is linked to diseases such as diabetes. If we overuse that and we thrash that to death, we can start to go down a diabetic pathway. But when we rest our gut, everything gets a rest, and this gut microbiome gets a chance to just rebalance itself and optimize itself, which has these huge positive flow-on effects to our physical and mental health. So aside from the benefits of weight regulation or losing weight, which is why people often look towards intermittent fasting, there's these other hidden benefits. So it's a really, really powerful strategy to optimize ourselves both physically and mentally. And when we look at how to get into intermittent fasting, a great strategy is working towards a 16 and 8 fasting schedule. And now what I'm referring to there is breaking up your day in hours, so your 24 hours, where you fast for 16 hours and then you have this feeding window or this eating window of 8 hours. And that might sound a bit daunting if you haven't attempted it before, but when you break that down, it simply means having your last meal at 8 o'clock at night, so having your dinner and not eating after 8 p.m, and then fasting through until lunchtime the following day. So if you can go from 8 p.m. through to midday the following day, that's your 16-hour fast. A chunk of that will have been spent sleeping, so that's often the way that people get into this, because you don't notice being in that fasted, hungry state as much if you're sleeping, and then you kick off your eating window at midday, take it through till 8 p.m. the following day, and that's this 16 and 8. Now, some people find they can click straight into that. Most people find they want to ease into that. And so a good way to ease into that intermittent fasting schedule is to just start pushing your breakfast back a little bit each day or every other day. So say, for instance, if you normally had breakfast at 6 a.m., then try and delay it till 6:30 or 7, 7:30, 8, and gradually start pushing that breakfast further and further back until you're skipping breakfast altogether and having your first meal of the day at midday. That's 16 and 8, and that's a pretty common intermittent fasting schedule, one that most people find they can tolerate well and starts to get us those benefits of the weight regulation, but equally those hidden benefits of little spikes in human growth hormone, in spikes of the autophagy that allows us to clean house with our cells that are damaged or dying or starting to go down an infective or otherwise diseased pathway, and to get that other benefit of resting our gut periodically so our microbiome stays optimized. So there's just a handful of other reasons why intermittent fasting is a fantastic strategy. Look, while I'm a doctor myself and I've been practicing intermittent fasting 16 and 8 regularly, and then longer fasts out to 48 hours, even longer on occasion, I've been doing that for years. None of this is designed to be medical advice. Everyone's different. Certain people shouldn't be doing intermittent fasting, and so if you have underlying health conditions, particularly things like insulin-dependent diabetes, other conditions with your gastrointestinal tract, then you probably don't want to be looking at this without some medical advice. And indeed, anyone out there, even if you're fit, young and healthy, I'd recommend that you touch base with your doctor first for a checkup before you consider doing intermittent fasting. But for the average healthy person in the population, the science suggests it's a safe thing to do, and it's a great thing to do for your physical and mental health. So look, thank you for joining me for this video. I hope that shed some light on this. Maybe it's spiked a bit of interest in having a go at intermittent fasting. Keep an eye out or check out my other videos that are linked to this one, where I'll talk about ketosis. And so just briefly, ketosis. You might have heard of keto diets. That relates to running down your body's stores of carbohydrate. So it's a low carbohydrate diet where your body will eventually run out of all its stored carbohydrate and start to tap into your fat stores and break them down into things called ketone bodies that your body can use as a fuel source as well as glucose. So check out my other video around keto and the benefits of ketosis, and a further video on what happened when I fasted for 48 hours. So I'll talk you through that process, what happened with my blood sugar levels, what happened with my ketones while I fasted for 48 hours and continued to exercise. You know, you can do that exercise in a fasted state. So I'll take a deep dive in that in my other video around that fast. So look, thank you once again. Great to have you with me on the channel. Would love to have you as part of the tribe. So I encourage you to follow along, to subscribe. If you want to be notified, then click the notification button. If you want to comment, would love to hear from you. If there's things that you'd like me to discuss on the channel that you want to hear my opinion on, put it in the comments. But cheers for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.